This morning I have chosen a very, very common passage, the Gospel according to John chapter 4, verses 23 to 24. And according to this text, I have entitled the sermon as Worship Beyond Walls. Some of us might have already noticed, but for some who don't know, this is the theme for the worship team of NCF Pune for the year 2025-26. I was not preparing to share on this, but during my mid-preparation, my heart and my mind was directed to this passage. So I believe, God will speak to us through this passage this afternoon. When we talk about worship, I believe that worship is one of the most beautiful, or it is the greatest gift that God has given to humankind. Isn't it truly beautiful that we human beings, we are made not just to work, not just to live, not just to survive, but to worship. I remind myself and I consider it a privilege that we are made to worship, that we have the privilege to worship God, our Creator, the one who is perfect, the one who is sovereign. I consider that as a blessing. And when we come to worship, we all have an understanding of worship. We all worship, and it might differ from one to another, our understanding, and how we worship. And when we talk about worship in the Old Testament, the word worship in Hebrew, it means shachar. Now it means to bow down, an act of reverence, submission, surrender. And even in the passage in John chapter 4, verses 23 to 24, in the New Testament, in Greek, the word worship, which has been used here multiple times, in Greek it is proskuneo. And it is very much similar again to the Old Testament, which means to bow down. Like a subject bowing down before a king, a humble surrender. Now in the Old Testament, worship was mostly external, and it was mostly centered towards God's covenant to Israel. And worship was mostly or largely place-centered. But when we see in the New Testament and when we see in this passage, Jesus has redefined worship. And we will look into that. So when we look into John chapter 4, if we have our Bibles, I want us to just keep it open so that we can keep referring to it. In John chapter 4, when you look into the background and context of this, we see that Jesus is traveling back from Judea to Galilee. And in order for Jesus to travel back to Galilee, he has to cross Samaria. So while on his way from Judea to Galilee, Jesus comes to the Samaritan city. And in that city, he comes to Sychar. So he comes to a plot of land which is given to Joseph by his father Jacob, where Jacob's well is there. And worn out and tired by the journey, Jesus sat there at the well. And it is at that place where Jesus and the Samaritan woman encounters. And it is at that place where Jesus and the Samaritan woman has a conversation, a deep conversation. But that conversation between them is not a casual one, but it is very significant. Because during those times, Jews avoided Samaria because of the deep hostility between Jews and Samaria. The Samaritans, their doctrines were considered unholy, wrong, and they were often considered impure. Samaria, they worshipped in Mount Gerizim, and Jews, they worshipped at Jerusalem. So this itself clearly states that the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman is not a casual one, but it is a very significant one. And more because Jesus is not only having a conversation with a Samaritan, but because that happens to be a woman. And not only because, again, she is a woman, but because she is a woman with a bad moral past. So this conversation is a cross-cultural, religiously sensitive, and socially a shocking one. And they have a meaningful and a long conversation where Jesus starts from the living water and ends with true worship. So cutting it short, Jesus begins by talking about living water and it ends with worship. Now they are having a meaningful conversation. And the conversation suddenly jumps to the location of the worship. The woman, being anxious, curious, she asks and she says to Jesus, our ancestors have said, or they have believed, or they have been worshiping in Mount Gerizim. But you say to worship in Jerusalem, which is the right one? Which are we to follow? Which is wrong? How are we supposed to do? And Jesus replies, saying, the hour is coming, and the time will come whether neither you are going to worship in Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem. And it leads to verse 23. I want to read it for us. And it says, but the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship Him. But the hour is coming and is now here. You know this phrase, it signifies a new era. It is about the arrival of God's kingdom through Jesus Christ. And when it says true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, and it's talking about new era where God's kingdom. Now Jesus is saying that worship is no longer going to be a place-centered. Worship is not going to be confined just to Jerusalem nor on Mount Gerizim. It's not going to be confined just to a sacred place. But worship is going to be centered around Jesus. It's going to be more than a place. For the Father seeks such as this to worship Him. When the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as this to worship Him. Now Jesus is telling the Samaritan woman that God is seeking true worshippers, and these true worshippers are not defined or they are not confined to geographical locations. They are not defined by ethnicity or religious background. But these true worshippers are going to worship God in spirit and in truth. And in the next verses onwards, Jesus explains how this worship must happen. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. It says that God is spirit. That means God's nature is spirit itself. That means we have a freedom, and we are no longer confined to worship just in the church. We are not just longer confined to worship just in the sacred or holy place. That means now we have the freedom to worship in our workplace, worship in our homes, worship in marketplaces, or wherever we are. We have that freedom to worship. And when God says those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth, He talks about that. That is why whenever we are even beyond the church, outside the church, we have that freedom to connect. We have that freedom to worship God. And that is why we worship beyond the church. When we close our eyes and we pray, we are worshiping. But it is not necessary that we need to close our eyes and pray. Even when we are not closing our eyes, whenever even we are outside, we have that freedom to worship. But the reason we close our eyes is that so that we do not get distracted by the things that we see. Today, the problem with us believers, backsliding. Saying that we are believers, we worship. But despite of us worshiping, why do we backslide? Why do we fall again and again? Why do we not have that consistency? Is there something wrong in our worship? If our worship is not grounded on the Word of God, if our worship is not doctrinally sound, if our worship is not centered on Jesus Christ, there is something wrong in our worship. And no matter how we worship, how many times we try again and again, there is always going to be something wrong, and we are going to fail again and again. You know, growing up, I always had a question in my mind. Because we belong to a state where we consider the revival services, the campings, or prayer centers very sacred, very important. I always had a question in my mind growing up as a kid. You know, whenever we are attending church camps, whenever we are attending revival programs, whenever we are in prayer centers, our faith is always reignited. We always have that spirit burning. But the moment that ends, the moment we step out, just a day or two, that fire, it just vanishes. We slide back. And I always had wondered, is it something wrong? What is it? And maybe I have come to that understanding is that it is because most of us believers, our worship is not grounded in the Bible. We are not meditating on the Bible, the Word of God. Our worship is not doctrinally sound, I think. Our worship is not centered on Jesus Christ, I think. But I think we are mostly driven emotionally. And I think that is very dangerous for us as believers. Most of the time we are driven emotionally. But when we talk about Jesus, worship, Jesus talks about here, a believer must, a true worshiper must worship in spirit and in truth. It teaches us that our worship needs to be grounded in the Bible. Our worship needs to be grounded and centered on Jesus and on theology, sound doctrine. If we are worshiping truly, church, I want us to understand, it is not going to be simple. But what we need to understand is that worship transforms. Worship truly transforms. When we look at the Samaritan woman, she did not live as she came. She did not live just as she encountered Jesus. When she came and when she encountered Jesus, she came as broken. But when she met Jesus, she was transformed. And she did not live just as she was, but she left as a witness. Today, are we able to be a witness of Jesus Christ? As a question which I want us to ponder upon. You know what I love about NCF when I joined NCF was the Bible study group, the cell group. I found it really fruitful, and that has really shaped me. And even this year, it has been really something special, and the Bible study cell group is multiplying, is being fruitful. And now even I see the updates of the youths, the mothers, and several groups. I think that is really fruitful. And I believe that those groups are being blessed as much as they are blessed every Sunday. That is what it is all about. Worship is not just being confined to these four walls of the church. No, whenever I see the updates of these Bible study cell groups, especially the mothers, I feel really encouraged. I feel really blessed. There's always a smile in my face. But it does not end there as well. Whenever I see them as well, I also feel hungry. The mothers will know. Those Bible studies, they're not only being fed spiritually, but even physically, they're being blessed in so many ways. Really amazing. Back home just recently, when we were having a prayer, when the church was praying for the new leaders, the new deacons, one of my pastors, she said to the deacons, because they have so many responsibilities and they do lots of good things, my pastor, she told the deacons, I do not want you to leave your responsibility at the office. I do not want you to be neglecting your works at the office and come and perform duties at the church. Even if you are performing duties, even if you are working, even if you are serving at the church, if you are failing at your workplace, you are failing God. And I really love that. And she, my pastor, she told them, before you come to the church and before you serve here, you need to be serving in your office faithfully. You need to be working there honestly. You need to be serving the people there, because that is your worship place. That is how you are going to worship. That is how your worship is going to start there. And that I found it very beautiful. And I think today most of us, we miss that. It is really beautiful when we worship in the church. Seems as if it is really beautiful, it is perfect. But how is our worship in our home? How is our worship in our workplace? In our marketplace when we get out from the church? That is a big question. No, we cannot call ourselves true worshipers when we do not treat people right. It is a very simple fact that we know, but something which we fail to do. You and I, how can we call ourselves true worshipers when we cannot treat people right? We are gossiping, we are pulling each other down, we are pointing fingers, we come to our own conclusions, we are quick to judge, we have egos. And with all these things, it is very difficult for us to call ourselves as true and faithful worshipers of God. Worship is not just about coming here, lifting our hands and singing praises. Worship is not just about here standing and preaching. Worship is not just about coming here and praying. But the moment when we step out, when we treat people right, when we serve, when we obey, when we give, when we are patient, we are serving, we are worshiping. I think that is what worship is all about. So the big question for us this afternoon is, how is our worship? How is your worship? And how is my worship? No, there is a beautiful statement which says, if worship does not change our life, it has not reached our heart. I want to repeat it again. If worship does not change our life, it has not reached our heart. And it has been 4 years, even for me, 4 years running here in NCF. And if my life is still the same, then the way I have been worshiping is wrong. There is something wrong. There is something missing. Because worship transforms. It takes us forward. It makes us better. And it does not just ends with us, but it will also transform the ones around us. We become a witness. We become an identity where people start to see Jesus in us. True worship does not end in church, but it goes beyond, and it becomes a mission. You know, when Pastor Robert approached me to lead the worship team, I was very hesitant, and I just said no. I said no a couple of times. I said, no, I cannot take it up. Because I was so much convicted in my heart, and I was so much hesitant. Because I felt it is a big responsibility not to come and speak or sing. That is the easy part. But because coming and standing here, leading worship every Sunday, singing, speaking, and praying, and if I cannot live after I step out from the church that way, no, my worship is failing. And I was scared for that. And that is the reason why I said no again and again. But with time again, with prayers, I was reminded again. And I took up that responsibility, and it became a reminder that none of us are perfect. And God is not looking for perfect worshipers. But it mentions here, God is looking for true worshipers who wants to worship Him in spirit and in truth. God is seeking for that heart who is willing to worship. And when I was meditating, one of the most beautiful thing, in verse 23, the Father seeks such as these to worship Him. Father seeks. So it made me realize that worship does not begin with us seeking God. But worship begins with God searching for us. God is not seeking for a perfect worship, like I've said, but He is looking for a relationship which is both-sided, where efforts are being made from both sides. And the big question for us this afternoon is, do we have that effort for that relationship? Time and time again, I always think, whether it is back home in my church or whether here in NCF, how is the spiritual growth of our church members? How are we worshiping outside and beyond the church? I always worry. Because as a worship leader, what I believe, if my church member is not worshiping in the right way, if that worship is not being carried beyond this church, then I as a worship leader is failing. I as a leader, I am failing. And I do believe that is my responsibility. Most of the time we fail because we do not have that consistency. Worship begins from our home place. If we are not praying daily in our homes with our family, we are going to slide back. There is not going to be growth. Only when it starts from the family, the Bible studies, the prayers, the encouragement, it grows. Now today I understand why my mother would always force us, to have prayer every night. Now she will not spare any one of us to skip prayer meetings. And today as I look back, I truly thank my mom. No, we will get angry at our mom because, it was not just a prayer meeting, it was not just prayers, but we will all read Bibles, we will all meditate, there will be Bible studies, we will sing, and it was long. And we used to hate that, but now looking back, I think there is so much to be grateful for. True worship begins from our home. And from our home, it goes on to our workplaces, outside. Then, only then, it comes to the church. When we, as a member, when we as believers, NCF, if our worship is right, if we are doing well at our homes, at our workplaces, at our school places, at our marketplaces, when our worship is right, when we come every Sunday, our worship is going to be very powerful. If we come to church, and if you feel that I'm not being touched, if you feel that I do not get convicted, if you feel that nothing is speaking to me, if you do not feel anything, if you are not being reignited, if you are not being challenged, I think there is something wrong in our worship. And we need to see how our daily personal devotion is. I think we need to go back and check how our worship at our workplace, at our home is. Because until and unless we are doing right there, it'll be right here. If there is nothing behind there, and if we come every Sunday here also, it is just going to be a ritual. It is just going to be a performance. And God is not seeking for rituals. He does not want performance, but He is looking for believers who will worship in spirit, in truth. He is looking for faithful believers, worshipers, who are going to worship from the heart.